So my kids were fighting the other day at the dinner table, and it seemed that they were accusing each other of eating too much pizza. Well, of course, they had both had the exact same amount of pizza. There was enough for everybody. In fact, everybody had had plenty of their fill of pizza, but they were each yelling at each other, angry at each other because the pizza was gone. Blaming the other. You had more pizza. No, they had not. They had each had the same amount, but angry at each other that the pizza was gone. And at some point it occurred to me as I'm watching them argue with each other and yell at each other and blame each other for eating the pizza that was everybody's dinner, that it was easier for them to be mad at each other than to acknowledge the simple reality: there's only so much pizza, and when you eat it, it's gone. You can't have your cake or your pizza and eat it too. They didn't like the situation, but it was easier for them to be mad at somebody else they could blame, even though both of them were equally responsible for eating the pizza that day. Now, if the adults start pointing that out, if the grown-ups, the parents in the conversation start pointing that out, now we become the bad guys, and we're the ones they're wanting to blame. Again, because when you're a kid, it's easier to be mad at a situation, to be mad at somebody else in a situation, than just to acknowledge that you're sad about something. I notice the same situation, the same paradigm happens again and again and again in our lives. It happens in our household a lot. I've been noticing lately, as the weather gets warm, the things we've got outside in our front yard. One is this pot that at some point got shattered, and there was a while when my immediate reaction was, well, whose fault is it? And to get angry. It must have been one of the kids. They must have done it, or somebody must have put it in the wrong place, or who did this thing that made this bad thing happen, this pot break. And it occurs to me, maybe it's not that there's one person who did something wrong, but maybe I left it out when it got cold in the winter and it was more susceptible to get brittle, and maybe one of the kids accidentally knocks it over, and maybe all of us contributed. But man, it is so much easier when you find something broken in pieces. It is so much easier to get angry at someone, to find someone you can blame, someone you can make into the villain, into the bad guy, than simply to deal with it, to come to terms with the fact something is broken and that you are sad about it. Maybe that's just it. In so many words, maybe there's a lot of things in life that we are grieving and that we think we are just angry about. Or maybe we don't want to face that we are grieving about something, about a situation that it was beyond our control, and instead it feels easier, or it feels like there's something we can do about it if we get angry and look for someone we can be mad at. I mean, I'm sure everybody talks these days about the stages of grief, and that early on when there's a loss that we experience, one of our first gut reactions is to find somebody we can get mad at, we can be angry at, or point the finger at, that someone who can be the scapegoat for us. I remember years and years ago losing somebody who I loved very dearly, and how in the weeks afterwards, many in the family were we were on edge, and there was this temptation to look for somebody we could blame and make the bad guy. About, well, why is it that this bad thing happened? Why is it that the person that we love died? Who should have been watching? Who should have known that they were sick? Who should have done something or spoken up? Or how come? Who dropped the ball here? And maybe there are just times when there's something that is terrible, that is rotten, and the thing we need to acknowledge is to grieve it, to lament it, to say this is a terrible thing, and to lift it up and name the terribleness, instead of thinking we will make it all go away if we identify somebody we can blame, we can point the finger at. It feels to me like these days, so much of what we are going through collectively in these days of coronavirus is grief. We are grieving. And that's difficult for us to acknowledge, because there have been very, very few people who've actually died right in our community, some, but very, very few. And so it doesn't quite feel like grieving the loss of a loved one. And yet I think that's what we're going through. There are so many things that feel like loss in this time. The loss of how things were supposed to go, the activities we wanted to get to do, the changes to our normal life, the folks whose businesses, whose livelihoods have been put on hold or are on the brink of going under. And in those moments, it is very, very much like grieving a loss, like a death. And so often our first reaction in the face of death, in the face of grief, isn't to acknowledge that that's what's going on. We're looking for someone we can be mad at. We're looking for someone we can make into the villain. And so, man, it is so easy for us to find anybody we can find fault with. We don't like what the leaders have chosen to do. We don't like what national leaders or state leaders or local leaders do. We don't like what medical professionals say. It is so easy to decide to make them the villains because it is easier for us to find somebody we can blame, to put a black hat and make them into the villain, instead of acknowledging there are times when this isn't about one person did something wrong or said something wrong. This is about a rotten situation that there's maybe no easy way out of or no simple way to fix. Sometimes the thing you have to do with a broken thing is simply to acknowledge it's broken, and then we can talk about what do we do about it. Can we replace it? Can we mend it? Can we repair it? Can we make things over again? But maybe the first step, instead of being angry first, finding somebody we can blame, maybe it simply needs to start with acknowledging what we're doing is grieving. Because all the anger that gets pent up, whether we just sort of let it simmer inside and then we lash out at somebody else, or we decide to vent it all on social media and be angry at other people who really haven't deserved it or haven't done something malevolent, or maybe we just find ourselves just completely drained because we don't realize what's going on inside us. We're going through grief these days. We're feeling a loss. It's not one that feels like other losses, but that's what we're going through. That changes things, and then all of a sudden maybe it helps us to see that all that pent-up anger isn't useful. There's nothing we can do with it. Blaming or just being angry at people or taking shots at people because we're not happy with this situation doesn't fix things. It reminds me, oddly enough, of this scene in one of the Batman movies where Batman has Joker in the police interrogation room, and Batman is threatening and intimidating, growling and punching Joker, and Joker is laughing, and he says something damning to the superhero. He says, "You have so much strength, so much power, and nothing to do with it." There are some things in life that punching can't fix. There are some things in life that yelling or angry words or bitterness or rancor or malice, it can't fix. It maybe for the moment feels like that's what we need to do. We need to find somebody we can be angry at and shake our fists at them and yell at them, and we'll say mean things about them. But that doesn't solve things, and it doesn't really help us to deal with what we're going through. It's pretending the problem is that there's a villain we have to stop, instead of realizing what we are doing right now is grieving. There is healing that comes through grief, but the only way to get to healing is through the grief. We have this way of wanting to short-circuit it and avoid the grief part, and instead get right to the who do we have to punch, who do we have to yell at, who can we be angry at to get things right again. And maybe that's not how this works. Maybe what we're living through is a lot more like the book of Job, right? Where the central figure suffers and loses things and has to grieve the loss of business and livelihood and family and the old sense of normal. And for a while, he thinks maybe what I need to do is be angry at somebody. But in the end, what he needs simply is to be able to come face to face with God and say, I'm grieving this loss. And that's all. That's all that it takes in the end. In the end, the only conclusion that Job gets isn't that he gets to punch out some villain. He never even finds out at the end of the book of Job about the whole business about Satan lurking in the background, letting these mean, bad things happen to him. Instead, Job simply has to grieve. He has to go through loss, acknowledge this is a world where terrible things happen. And then how am I going to deal with a world and a God where terrible things can happen in the world, and yet God can be in the midst of it? Where we're at right now, well before we are coming out of this crisis, this grief time, this loss that it feels like we are living through right now, the thing for us to acknowledge maybe is that we are grieving. and that no amount of finger pointing or yelling or being angry at the people who make decisions that are different than what we would have chosen, that won't fix things. Even just venting the anger doesn't really help. Eventually you leave behind the stage of anger, and at some point in grief you come to terms with, I have experienced a loss. I can honor and remember the things that are lost. I can rebuild things that I need to rebuild. I can start over again. But we can't stay in the angry place. That's like kids fighting at the dinner table, blaming who ate the pizza when everybody is responsible for the eating of the pizza. That's like me deciding that yelling at people for breaking the pot will put it back together when I'm partially to blame too. Maybe these days the thing we need to do, the difficult work but the freeing work we need to do, is to acknowledge we have been grieving these days. And that it is through those moments where it feels like we're in the valley of the shadow of death, where it feels like grief is maybe all we got, that then we can look for God to lead us forward one step at a time.